Ambassador J-Ho stood at the window of the diplomatic shuttle as it moved through space toward Meridian Station. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, tired and worried. Behind him, his assistant Min-Soo was trying very hard to keep 5-year-old Tae-Sung from pressing all the buttons on the shuttle's control panel. The boy's small fingers kept reaching toward the glowing lights, and Min-Soo kept gently pulling them back, over and over again. J-Ho had made a very big decision. A decision that most people would say was crazy. A decision that could change everything for humanity, or it could ruin everything. He was bringing his son to the most important meeting in human history. The shuttle moved past floating debris fields from ancient wars. These were the remains of battles that had happened thousands of years ago, and they still floated in space as warnings. J-Ho had read the history. The 7 unified species had fought each other for centuries before they created the Accord. The Accord was a set of rules that kept peace in the galaxy. One of those rules was very clear. No apex species could attend diplomatic missions. An apex species was a species that hunted other creatures, that had natural warrior instincts, that organized themselves through military power and strength. The Accord said these species could not come to peace talks. This was because apex species could not be trusted. They would always be thinking about how to win, how to dominate, how to take control. They could not think about peace the way other species did. Humanity had never been classified as an apex species. This was the problem, and also the solution. J-Ho had spent the last 6 months arguing with lawyers and politicians about this fact. He had written long papers explaining that humans were not apex predators in the way the Accord defined. Yes, humans had a hunting history. Yes, humans had fought terrible wars. But humans had changed. Humans had learned philosophy and art and love. Humans had learned to control their worst instincts. The legal team in Earth had agreed with him, barely. It was a close decision. Some people said he was wrong. Some people said bringing a child was madness. But J-Ho believed something very important. Humanity needed to show the galaxy what they really were, and what they really were could not be explained in words. It had to be shown. Tae-Sung suddenly ran to J-Ho and wrapped his arms around his father's leg. The boy was excited now. His eyes were bright and full of wonder. Through the window, Meridian Station was becoming larger and larger. The station was unlike anything that existed on Earth. It had shapes and curves that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Crystal towers rose from its surface, glowing with internal light. Bridges of pure energy connected different sections. The whole station hummed with a gentle power that made the air feel alive. "Daddy, look! It's so big! It's like nothing I have ever seen!" Tae-Sung pulled at J-Ho's hand, jumping up and down with excitement. J-Ho smiled despite his nervousness. This was exactly why he had brought his son. This wonder, this innocence, this pure joy at seeing something new. This was what humanity really was. Not weapons, not conquest, just the endless curiosity of a child facing a new world. The shuttle began to slow down. Its landing sequence was starting. Min-Soo stood up and checked that Tae-Sung's clothes were clean and neat. Diplomatic rules said that appearance mattered. The way you dressed, the way you held yourself, the way you presented your species to the galaxy. All of this was part of the message. Min-Soo had chosen simple clothes for Tae-Sung. Not fancy formal wear that would look strange on a child. Just clean, simple clothes that showed what a human child really looked like. As the shuttle touched down on the crystalline platform, J-Ho felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment. This was when everything would change. He took a deep breath and reached down to take Tae-Sung's hand. The boy held his hand firmly, trusting and excited. The doors opened and warm air touched their faces. The air of Meridian Station was different from Earth air. It was cleaner somehow, almost too clean. It smelled like nothing and everything at the same time. Jae-ho stepped out first, holding Tae-sung's hand tight. Min-soo followed behind them, carrying the diplomatic cases that held all their documents and instruments. The platform was massive. It stretched out in every direction like a polished mirror. And gathered on that platform were creatures that looked nothing like humans. The Valdris delegates had bodies made of crystalline material that caught the light and threw it in rainbow patterns. They were beautiful and strange and utterly alien. Their appendages moved with a liquid grace, and their sounds were like wind chimes mixed with whale songs. Everything about them was different. Next to the Valdris stood the Kethlin delegation. They were large creatures, with many limbs and a skin texture like tree bark. Their eyes were dark and intelligent, and they moved very slowly, as if every action required careful thought and planning. Behind them floated the Vexri, insectoid beings with compound eyes and wings that hummed with a sound just at the edge of hearing. The air around them seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they were surrounded by invisible vibrations. All eyes turned toward Jae-ho and his delegation. All eyes fell upon Tae-sung. The boy did not notice the strangeness of their appearance. He did not feel the weight of the moment. He simply held his father's hand and looked up at the tallest beings he had ever seen with eyes full of wonder. He held a stuffed rabbit toy in his other hand, its fabric soft and worn from years of being loved. A sound came across Jae-ho's neural implant, a translation of the Valdris language. The voice belonged to Speaker Kren, the most important Valdris delegate. "This is a violation of the Accord. You have brought a juvenile to a diplomatic assembly." The words were clear and sharp and impossible to ignore. Jae-ho knelt down slightly, making sure his face could be seen by all the camera feeds, by all the aliens watching. He wanted them to see his expression when he spoke. "With respect, my species is not classified as apex predatory. The treaty restricts apex species from attending. My species falls outside that definition. Therefore, bringing my son is not a violation." Around him, the aliens began to make sounds. The Kethlin made deep rumbling noises. The Vexri's humming grew louder. The Valdris's crystalline bodies began to vibrate in patterns that suggested alarm or confusion or anger. Jae-ho could not tell which. Tae-sung pulled on Jae-ho's arm. "Daddy, why is that one all glowy? Is it made of glass?" And in that moment, with his son's innocent question hanging in the air, Jae-ho knew that his gamble would either change everything or destroy everything. There was no middle ground now. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity really was. The question was whether they would understand. The conference hall was built like a great cathedral of light and mathematics. Its walls were not really walls, but fields of energy that could be adjusted and shaped. Its ceiling stretched up so high that it seemed to touch the stars themselves. In the center of the hall stood massive communication devices that could translate language across species instantly. Every word spoken by any delegate would be converted into the language, the sounds, the vibrations, even the pheromones that each species used to communicate. Jae-ho sat at the human table with his team. To his left sat Han-na, the brilliant young lawyer who had fought so hard for humanity's right to attend these talks. She was calm and sharp, with a mind like a cutting knife. She understood the law better than anyone Jae-ho knew. To his right sat Min-soo, who kept one careful eye on Tae-sung, who sat in the observation gallery above them with a professional caretaker watching him. The debate about Jae-ho's violation of the Accord had been going on for 16 hours now. 16 hours of arguing and discussing and examining every word of the treaty. Around the hall sat representatives from all the 7 unified species. They looked exhausted. Some of them had not rested because their biology did not work the same way as humans. They just kept going, driven by duty and the weight of the decision they had to make. Hanna stood up now and walked to the center of the hall. All eyes in the room turned toward her. She was small compared to many of the aliens, but she moved with confidence and strength. She activated the translation systems, and when she spoke, her words became visible in light patterns, vibrations, chemical signals. Every being in that room could understand her. The Accord defines an apex species in 3 ways, Hanna said, her voice steady and clear. First, a species that evolved as carnivores, as meat-eaters. Second, a species that hunted other creatures as a way of life. And third, a species that organized itself through military power and dominance hierarchies. She paused and looked around the room. Humans do not fit this definition anymore. Yes, our ancestors were hunters. Yes, we killed animals for food. But we stopped doing this thousands of years ago. We learned agriculture. We learned how to make food grow. Today, many humans do not eat meat at all. The Kethlin delegates made deep sounds like rocks rolling through a canyon. The Valdris's crystalline bodies shifted slightly. The Vexri's compound eyes grew even larger with attention. Hanna continued. Second, humans evolved past hunting behavior. We have not hunted other species for thousands of years. We have not even hunted each other in our wars. Not truly. Not in the evolutionary sense. Our wars are political, not predatory. They are still wars, Speaker Kren said, his words becoming visible in rainbow light patterns. They are still organized killing. How is that not predatory? Hanna had been waiting for this question. Jeho could see the slight smile on her face. Because, she said, the outcome of human wars is not food, not territory in the hunting sense, not the domination needed for survival. Often, human wars end with humans helping their former enemies. We share food with them. We rebuild their cities. We teach their children. That is not predatory behavior. That is something else. In the observation gallery above, Tae-sung was drawing pictures. The caretaker had given him colored pencils and paper. He was sketching the aliens he saw below him. He had drawn the Valdris as a creature made of light. He had drawn the Kethlin as a large tree with eyes. His pictures were simple and strange, and somehow very true. The Vexri colony mind, which spoke through a single representative, transmitted its question. You say humans are not apex predators, and yet your species has developed terrible weapons. Nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. This is predatory behavior. Hanna nodded. Yes, we developed weapons, but we did not use them. We created weapons so powerful that we could destroy ourselves, and then we decided not to use them. We created a law, a rule that said these weapons were too terrible to use. We chose not to be predatory, even when we had the power to be. Why would a species choose not to use power that it created? The Kethlin asked. Their slow minds were struggling with this concept. Because, Hanna said quietly, we learned something. We learned that what we loved was more important than what we could conquer. We learned that our children's future mattered more than our power in the present. Below the gallery, Tae-sung looked up from his drawing. He was asking the caretaker questions about the aliens around him. His voice was small and innocent, and it carried strangely in the great hall. Why do they have shields? He asked, pointing at the energy barriers that surrounded some of the Valdris delegates. Are they scared of something? The caretaker whispered an answer, but Tae-sung kept pushing with the innocent curiosity of a child. Scared of what? Scared of each other? The words hung in the air. They were translated automatically. Every being in that conference hall heard the child's question. Why do they have shields? Why are they scared of each other? Speaker Kren's crystalline body went very still. The Kethlin delegates stopped moving entirely. Even the Vexri's vibrations seemed quiet. Hanna looked up at Jeho. Their eyes met for just a moment. They both understood what had just happened. A 5-year-old child, in one simple question, had revealed something that all their legal arguments could not. He had shown the truth about why the Accord existed. It existed because the 7 unified species were afraid of each other. They put shields around themselves because they did not trust. They did not trust because they were apex predators themselves, and apex predators understand predatory behavior instinctively. They recognized it in each other and therefore feared it. But Tai Sung did not understand fear. He did not understand the shields as weapons. He simply understood them as something strange, something that needed explaining. And in his innocent question, he had cut through all the law and all the argument and all the careful words. The debate continued for hours more, but something had changed. The question had been asked. The shield had been revealed not as protection, but as proof of fear. And as the hours passed, as the arguments continued, Jae-ho watched the aliens slowly begin to understand what he had known all along. You could not argue that humans were not apex predators. But you could show that humans had become something different, something that understood predatory nature but had chosen not to follow it, something that could hold a child's hand and be brave enough to bring that child into the center of danger because they believed in something beyond power and control. The Valdris delegate's voice came through the translation system one more time. "This is most irregular. This breaks all protocols. And yet—" He paused, his crystalline form glowing more brightly. "And yet we can find no legal way to remove the human child from these proceedings." Hanna smiled. The shield, Jae-ho realized, would remain. But perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, the beings behind those shields were beginning to wonder if they really needed them. By the 4th day of the negotiations, everyone was tired. Humans needed sleep, and they were not getting enough. The aliens did not need sleep in the same way, which gave them an advantage. But Jae-ho noticed that they looked tired in different ways. The Valdris's crystalline surfaces had become dull. The Kethlin's movements had become even slower, as if they were moving through thick liquid. The Vexri's wings were beating less frequently. The negotiations were not going well. The humans had expected to make agreements on trade, on technology sharing, on cultural exchange. Instead, the entire discussion kept circling back to the question of whether humans belonged in this room at all. The 7 unified species were united in almost everything, but they were divided on humanity. Some wanted humans admitted as equals. Others wanted humans to prove themselves first. Still others wanted humans removed from human space entirely, quarantined until they could prove they were not a threat. It was during this difficult moment that something strange happened. One of the junior Valdris delegates, a smaller crystalline, being called Rezan, began to change. His outer surface started to crack and break. Not in a violent way, but in a slow, terrible way. Parts of his structure were separating from other parts. His internal light, which had been bright and steady, began to flicker and pulse in patterns that looked wrong, that looked like pain. Rezan made a sound that no translation system could process. It was a frequency that existed between the languages the aliens used. It was a pure, raw sound of suffering. The security teams moved quickly. They created energy barriers around Rezan, trying to contain whatever was happening. They called for medical help, but the frequency he was transmitting grew stronger and stronger. Other Valdris delegates began to shield themselves. The Kethlin covered their sensory organs. The Vexri's vibrations became frantic. The frequency was causing physical pain to anyone who could perceive it. For the crystalline Valdris, it was like feeling the sound of their own breaking. For the Kethlin, it was a pressure that made their bodies ache. Even the Vexri, who perceived the world through pheromones, were suffering because Rezan's molecular breakdown was creating waves of chemical distress that they could not avoid. Min Su grabbed Jae-ho's arm. We need to get Tae-sung out of here! But Jae-ho was frozen. He could not hear the frequency that was hurting the aliens. Human ears could not perceive it, but he understood what was happening. A being was suffering. A being was breaking apart. A being was in pain, and everything in that great hall was trying to contain it, to isolate it, to shield against it. In the observation gallery, the caretaker stood up quickly and tried to move Tae-sung away from the window that looked down into the conference hall. But Tae-sung had already seen something. He had seen Resin's light flickering and changing. To a child's eyes, it looked not like pain, but like something broken, something that needed fixing. Tae-sung pulled away from the caretaker's grip. He was small and quick and determined. Before anyone could stop him, he had run out of the observation gallery and down the emergency stairs that led to the conference floor. The security fields at the entrance, which had been designed to detect apex predatory threats, recognized Tae-sung as a small, weak biological being with no capacity for violence. They let him pass through without resistance. Jae-ho saw his son running toward the energy barriers that surrounded Resin. "Tae-sung, stop!" But Tae-sung was already moving beyond the barriers. The fields that had let him pass through also let him move deeper without resistance. A 5-year-old was not a threat. To the security systems of beings designed to fear apex predators, a human child was less dangerous than a dust particle. Tae-sung reached Resin's crystalline form. The light inside the crystal was pulsing wildly, painfully. Tae-sung did what a child does when faced with something broken. He did not try to fix it with technology. He did not try to contain it with barriers. He did what was instinctive and what was purely, completely human. He touched the crystal with one small hand and began to hum. The song was a lullaby. Tae-sung's mother had taught it to him when he was an even smaller child, when he could not sleep, when the world seemed too large and too strange. The melody was simple and slow, with notes that rose and fell like waves. It was a song that promised safety. It was a song that said, "Everything will be okay." Resin's fractured light began to respond. The frequency that had been chaotic and wild started to synchronize with Tae-sung's humming. The boy's voice, untrained and small, began to match the vibration patterns of the Valdris's molecular structure. The universe suddenly had a harmony where there had been only noise. The pain in the conference hall began to ease. The Kethlins stopped covering their sensory organs. The Vexaries' vibrations began to settle into normal patterns. The Valdris delegates' crystalline surfaces began to clear and brighten again. Jae-ho stood frozen at his seat, watching his son hold his small hand against the crystal being's surface, singing a lullaby to an alien that looked nothing like anything on Earth. Tears were running down his face. He did not know if they were tears of terror, or pride, or love, or all three together. The Valdris delegate Resin's light stabilized. The fracture pattern began to slow. The pain frequency that had been tearing through the conference hall faded into silence. Slowly, carefully, Tae-sung finished his lullaby and stepped back from the crystal being. Speaker Kren's voice came through the translation system, and it sounded different. It sounded like something that had never existed before in that crystalline being's existence. It sounded like wonder. "What is the child doing?" he asked. Jae-ho stood up. His legs felt weak. His voice felt strange coming from his mouth. "Being human," he said softly. The entire conference hall was silent. Resin's light pulsed steadily now, regular and peaceful. The medical teams moved cautiously forward to check on him. The junior Valdris delegate's molecular structure was stable. He had survived his fracture cascade, and he had survived because a 5-year-old human child had sung him a lullaby. An apex predator, faced with suffering, would have seen an opportunity for advantage. An apex predator would have demanded something in return for help. An apex predator would have used the situation to gain power. A human child had simply offered comfort. And in offering that simple thing, Tae-sung had revealed something about his species that no legal argument, no logical explanation, no careful demonstration could ever have shown. The shields that the seven unified species had built around themselves had not come down. But in that moment, they became a little less necessary. In that moment, the beings behind those shields began to understand that they were not looking at an apex predator at all. They were looking at something entirely different, something that understood pain without needing to cause it, something that could offer help without demanding power in return, something that could love a stranger, even though that stranger looked like nothing in the universe that humans had ever been designed to love. After Tae-sung's act of kindness toward Rezin, the atmosphere in the conference hall began to change. But the change was not simple, and it was not quick. The seven unified species were confused. They were deeply, fundamentally confused about what they had witnessed. The delegations demanded an explanation for how a human child had penetrated the security fields. The answer came back from the technical teams in a report that created even more confusion. The security systems, which had been designed thousands of years ago by the combined engineering knowledge of the seven species, had not flagged Tae-sung as a threat, not because he was human, not because he was an adult accompanied by a child, which might have seemed protective, but because every single threat detection algorithm, every scanner, every sensor in the entire security network had evaluated the biological being called Tae-sung and determined that he presented essentially zero danger. To the security systems of the seven unified species, a 5-year-old human child was less dangerous than a small animal. He was less of a threat than the spores that had attacked Station 7 3 years ago. He was less dangerous than the rogue artificial intelligence that had once infiltrated and nearly destroyed Meridian Station itself. He registered as barely above the level of biological background noise. A child. The significance of this fact hit different species in different ways. The Kethlin, who had evolved with complex family structures and intensive parental care, were particularly struck. In Kethlin society, young members of their species went through 17 different developmental stages before they were considered fully adult. During all those stages, they were completely helpless and vulnerable. Parents and family groups devoted enormous amounts of energy and time to keeping their young alive and protected. A young Kethlin could not even move on its own for the first 5 years of its life. This fact made them understand something about humans that shocked them. A human species that gave birth to young things that were so weak, so vulnerable, so dependent, was a species where survival had never been about individual strength or individual power. Survival had always been about families staying together, about love, about commitment that went beyond logic. The Valdris delegations held extended discussions in their crystalline communication network. They shared information through harmonic frequencies that humans could not hear. But afterward, Speaker Kren called for a formal session and asked a question that surprised Jae-ho. "Your species requires 2 decades for developmental maturation," Speaker Kren said, his voice thoughtful and slow. 2 decades of complete vulnerability. 2 decades when your young cannot feed themselves, cannot defend themselves, cannot even understand danger. You must spend 2 decades of resources and energy to produce a single adult being. Han-na stood up to respond, but Jae-ho put a hand on her shoulder. He wanted to answer this question himself. He stood and looked up at the crystalline delegate, this being made of light and geometry. "Yes," he said simply, "that is what humans do. We have children, and we protect them, and we teach them. And sometimes we bring them to very important places because we believe that what we are trying to protect matters more than any treaty or any negotiation." "But that is not logical," Speaker Kren said. "That is not practical. That is not the behavior of a species trying to dominate or acquire power." "No," Jae-ho agreed. "It is not. It is completely the opposite of that. It is irrational. It is inefficient. It is, if you think about it purely through a framework of apex predatory behavior, a terrible mistake. The Vexry colony mind transmitted through their representative. We are requesting cultural downloads regarding human development patterns. We are requesting historical records of human family structures. This is unusual. We wish to understand. Over the next days, the delegations began to examine humanity not through the framework of whether humans were or were not apex predators. Instead, they began to examine what made humans different from the species they were evaluating. And what they found was remarkable. The Kethlin noted that humans, despite being physical individuals, behaved more like a collective species than the Kethlin did. Humans formed groups based on love rather than on biological reproduction. They adopted children of other species without hesitation. They formed families with beings that were not related to them. The Valdris noted that humans, despite their predatory evolutionary history, had created elaborate systems to prevent themselves from using violence. They had created legal systems, ethical systems, religious systems, all designed to contain and redirect their own worst impulses. The Vexry noted that humans, despite their biological individuality, thought almost obsessively about their collective future. They made decisions not based on what was best for one human, but on what was best for humanity as a group. They sacrificed for a future they might not live to see. Your species is classified as apex predator, the Kethlin representative said after many hours of analysis. And yet your species is not organized in any way that an apex predator should be organized. You are violent and yet peaceful. You are individual and yet collective. You are rational and yet you commit acts of complete irrationality. You want to know why? Jeho asked. Yes, the Kethlin said. We very much want to understand. Jeho looked up at the great conference hall, at the beings who had seemed so alien and so hostile. Because, he said, a very long time ago, humans were indeed apex predators. We hunted, we fought, we dominated. But then something changed. We did not suppress the apex predator inside us. We did not kill it or deny it. He paused and looked toward the observation gallery, where Tai Sung was watching the adults talk. We learned to love, Jeho continued. We learned to love something more than we love power. We learned to love our children. We learned to love our mates. We learned to love our communities. And that love was stronger than the predatory instinct. That love changed what we were. How is love stronger than survival instinct? Speaker Kren asked. Jeho smiled sadly. Because love is a survival instinct, just a different kind. A kind that humans developed because we needed to protect our weak, vulnerable young for decades and decades. We evolved love because love is what kept our families together. Love is what made us willing to die to protect our children. Love is what made humans human. The conference hall was quiet. The 7 unified species had come to evaluate whether humanity was a threat, and what they were discovering was something they had never imagined. Humanity was not a threat because humanity had evolved past the need for threat. Humanity had become something that the other species could barely comprehend. They had become beings that could choose compassion over dominance, and that choice, made over and over again across millennia, had changed what humans were from the inside out. By the 9th day of the negotiations, the original treaty discussion had been abandoned. No one was talking anymore about whether humans had violated the accord. No one was debating whether humanity belonged in this diplomatic assembly. Instead, the delegations had become focused on something entirely different. They had become focused on understanding humanity. The questions that came from the 7 unified species were not questions about human military strength or technological capability. They were questions about human emotions, human family structures, human social organizations. The Kethlin wanted to understand how humans could love beings who were not biologically related to them. The Valdris wanted to understand what drove humans to sacrifice personal power for group benefit. The Vexri wanted to understand how human consciousness could function as a collective without being a colony mind. Jeho found himself spending less time in formal negotiations and more time simply explaining humanity. Hanna was doing the same. They told stories about human history. They explained human wars and human peace treaties. They talked about art and music and literature. They described the feeling of holding a child. They tried to explain love in a way that beings made of crystal and bark and hard chitin could possibly understand. And through it all, Tae-sung played in the observation areas. The boy was no longer confined to a single gallery. He had been given limited access to the station, with security escorts. He ate food from the station's international kitchens, prepared to be safe for human physiology. He slept in a comfortable room with windows that looked out at the stars. He lived in the midst of the 7 unified species as if he belonged there. Other young beings began to notice him. A young Kethlan delegate, not much older than Tae-sung in developmental terms, though it was physically much larger, began to come to the areas where the human child played. The Kethlan representative was not yet an adult. It was barely past its 8th developmental stage, still learning, still growing. It had been brought to Meridian Station by its parents as a way of providing education about the broader galaxy. The young Kethlan did not try to talk to Tae-sung at first. Instead, it simply watched. It observed how the human child played with simple toys, how he made up stories and acted them out, how he drew pictures on paper and showed them to adults, expecting and receiving appreciation for his work. Finally, on the 10th day, the young Kethlan approached Tae-sung. They did not speak. The young Kethlan had no translation matrix and could not produce human speech sounds, but it had brought something from its own culture. It held out several objects, geometric forms that changed color in response to thought patterns. To the Kethlan, these were teaching tools, ways of expressing abstract concepts and mathematical ideas. To Tae-sung, they were toys. The human child's face lit up with joy. He had been surrounded by adults for days, beings who looked nothing like him and who were focused on important diplomatic matters. And now here was a friend who wanted to play. The 2 young beings, one human and one Kethlan, sat down together on the polished floor of the station and began to play with the geometric forms. They communicated in the language of all young creatures everywhere. Tae-sung pushed one of the shapes and made it rotate. The young Kethlan responded by making a shape change colors. Tae-sung laughed. The young Kethlan made a deep rumbling sound that seemed to express pleasure and amusement. They were not exchanging information about treaties or peace or the future of the galaxy. They were simply playing. Over the next hours, other young beings began to gather around them. A young Valdris, smaller than the adult delegates but still made of crystal and light, came to observe. The being did not understand play in the way humans or Kethlan did, but it was curious. It began to experiment with the geometric forms, watching how its own light reflected differently off the shapes when they changed colors. Then came a young Vexri. This being was barely visible as an individual, more like a small cluster of the hive mind that made up its species' consciousness. But it came, drawn by the activity and the sounds of play. The insects clicked and buzzed in patterns that were almost musical. 5 young creatures of 4 different species gathered together, playing without any formal rules or language. They made structures from the geometric forms. They knocked them down and built them differently. They created patterns and games that had no meaning except the meaning they created together in that moment. Jeho watched from a distance with Speaker Kren standing beside him. The crystalline delegate's surface was reflecting the light of the playing young beings, creating beautiful patterns of rainbow color. "What are they doing?" Speaker Kren asked. Building a future, Jay-Ho said softly, just by playing. There is no strategic value in this, Speaker Kren said. There is no outcome, no winner, no advantage gained. That is the entire point, Jay-Ho replied. Humans have learned something that many species never learn. Humans have learned that not everything needs to have a strategic value. Not everything needs to result in power or advantage. The young Kethlin and Tae-sung knocked down a structure they had built together. It fell apart with satisfying crashes and tumbles of shape upon shape. And then, without any instruction or planning, all 5 young beings began to rebuild it together, creating something different, something new, something that none of them could have made alone. Han-na came to stand with Jay-Ho and Speaker Kren. Is the treaty going to be renegotiated? She asked. Speaker Kren took a long time before answering. His crystalline form pulsed slowly, thoughtfully. The original treaty, he said finally, was designed to restrict apex predatory species, to prevent beings who understood dominance and conquest from using their nature to gain power at the expense of others. Yes, Han-na said. Humans are apex predatory by evolution, Speaker Kren continued. Your ancestors hunted. Your species developed weapons of terrible destructiveness. Your history is written in blood, but... He paused. Around them, the young beings continued to play, creating and destroying and creating again without malice, without strategy, without anything except joy. But we have come to understand that your species represents a contradiction that should not exist. You are apex predators, and yet you are not predatory. You understand power, and yet you choose not to use it. You are capable of domination, and yet you choose community. Is that acceptable? Jay-Ho asked. It is unacceptable, Speaker Kren said. It violates all logic. It contradicts all evolutionary theory. It should not be possible. He turned to look at the human ambassador directly. And yet, the Valdris delegate continued, it is happening. Your child has shown us something that no words could express. Your species is something new, something that we have no classification for, something that should not work, and yet it does. What do you mean? Han-na asked. I mean, Speaker Kren said slowly, that we are going to have to create a new classification, a new category in the Accord, because humanity cannot be contained in the old definitions. You are not apex predators, and yet you are. You are dangerous, and yet you are peaceful. You are individuals, and yet you function as a unified species. He looked back at the playing young beings. You are something else entirely, and we need to find a name for it.